"You don't belong in first class," Karen sneered, her voice sharp and cold. Without a flicker of hesitation, she tore the boarding pass in half, right in front of the woman who had just handed it to her. To Karen, that piece of paper meant nothing. It was just a prop in a power play she'd grown far too comfortable performing. Her eyes, laced with contempt, scanned the woman from head to toe. Dressed in a simple black t-shirt and jeans, the woman didn't look like someone Karen believed should be anywhere near luxury. But what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that in less than 5 minutes this same woman would fire her, publicly, definitively, right in front of stunned passengers, an unprepared crew, and a string of live-streaming cell phone cameras. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning, and it would unveil the darkest truths Skywing Airlines had worked hard to conceal. Because the woman standing quietly in front of Karen wasn't just any traveler. She was Michelle Reed, billionaire investor, executive powerhouse, and owner of a 25% stake in Skywing Airlines. Michelle was known not only for her relentless business acumen, but for being a vocal advocate against injustice, particularly racial discrimination. Over the past year, alarming reports had surfaced. Passengers of color, despite holding valid tickets, were being mistreated, denied services, humiliated, or even displaced by white travelers deemed more deserving. These weren't isolated cases. They painted a chilling pattern. To Michelle, it wasn't just a public relations nightmare, it was personal. This was the company she had helped build, its integrity now hanging by a thread. So instead of hiding behind boardroom doors or drafting statements, she did something far braver. She boarded a flight undercover. That morning, she walked into Chicago O'Hare International Airport without fanfare. No designer labels, no assistants. Just a woman in a black tee, jeans, and worn sneakers, armed with a first-class ticket under her own name. Her mission was clear: experience the truth for herself. When Michelle arrived at the gate, she blended effortlessly into the sea of travelers. But what came next shook even her. As she stepped into the plane's first-class cabin, a subtle hush fell over the space. The soft glow from above cast elegant shadows over the cream leather seats. The setting was serene, almost surreal, but Michelle's eyes were focused. She wasn't here for the aesthetics. She was here for the truth. And truth, it turned out, wasted no time. Then striding toward her was Karen Anderson, lead flight attendant, mid-30s, with impeccably styled blonde hair and a uniform pressed to perfection. Her reputation within the airline was notorious: pristine appearance, poisoned attitude. She had a habit of policing who, in her eyes, looked worthy of premium service. Karen's eyes narrowed as she blocked Michelle's path. With a slow sweep of judgment from head to toe, she seemed to relish the moment of confrontation. Then, like a knife slicing through silence, she said it. "Ma'am, first class isn't for people like you." Gasps echoed from nearby passengers. Heads turned. A few travelers exchanged incredulous looks, unsure they'd heard correctly. Michelle stood tall, her expression unwavering. She had faced boardroom battles far harsher than this, but inside a quiet ache formed. No matter her success, her skin color still made her a target. With controlled grace, she responded, "Excuse me?" It was an invitation for Karen to rethink, to backpedal, to correct herself. But Karen doubled down. "You know exactly what I mean," she said coolly. "This cabin is for special guests. You'd be more comfortable in economy." Her voice wasn't loud by accident. She wanted everyone to hear her dismissal. Whispers rippled through the cabin. Discomfort spread like wildfire, yet Michelle didn't flinch. She calmly pulled her ticket from her pocket and offered it forward. It was real, verified, indisputable. But Karen didn't even glance at it. With a mocking laugh, she snapped, "We've seen tricks like this before. A fake ticket doesn't get you into first class, Ms. Reed." And with that, she ripped the ticket in half, right in Michelle's face. The sound of tearing paper cracked through the cabin like a whip. A few passengers visibly recoiled. The air turned electric with disbelief. Then, as if on cue, another figure entered the fray. Jason Miller, a junior flight attendant barely into his 20s, swaggered over with a smug grin. Arms folded, he eyed Michelle with thinly veiled disdain. "Trying to sneak into first class with cheap jeans and a t-shirt?" he snickered. "Next time you want to look rich, maybe dress like it." The insult landed like a slap. But Michelle didn't blink. She looked them both dead in the eye, the quiet weight of her presence now unmistakable. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to retaliate. Because she had something they didn't. The truth. And within minutes, the entire plane, Karen, Jason, the crew, and every watching passenger would learn who Michelle Reed really was. And what happens when power, patience, and justice take flight together. That single brutal tear of paper would go down as the worst mistake of their lives. A mistake whose consequences neither Karen nor Jason could have ever imagined. The sound of the torn ticket echoed like a dry crack of thunder. It wasn't just paper that was shredded. It was Michelle Reed's last thread of tolerance. The pieces fluttered to the ground, stark white against the rich navy carpet, like silent witnesses to a scene drenched in arrogance and ignorance. Michelle stood still. It wasn't humiliation that made her chest tighten. It was the deeper sting of betrayal. This wasn't just a rude employee. This was proof. Proof that a toxic, festering culture had taken root in the very company she had helped build. Bending down with grace, she retrieved half of the torn ticket, then rose to meet Karen's eyes. Not with anger, but with a chilling calm. Her gaze didn't beg for respect. It demanded accountability. Yet Karen didn't waver. Her voice rose, sharpened by the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "You're not fooling anyone with that fake ticket," she called out, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. It wasn't just about Michelle anymore. It was a spectacle, a warning, a line drawn in the sand to remind others that there were invisible rules about who belonged in first class and who didn't. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked away. Others stared, stunned, as the scene unfolded. And just as the tension peaked, Jason Miller re-entered the moment like fuel on fire. The young flight attendant smirked, his boyish arrogance on full display. "Seriously," he mocked, turning to Karen as if for backup. "You think a cheap t-shirt and jeans is your golden ticket into first class? If you're going to play rich, at least try harder." He chuckled at his own cruelty. A laugh hollow and sharp, and for a second, it seemed like they believed they had won. But Michelle remained still, serene. She didn't bite. She didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly reached into her wallet and pulled out 2 items, her official government-issued ID and a sleek jet-black metal card, the highest-tier Skywing Elite membership, only issued to the airline's most prestigious partners and investors. Holding both with steady hands, she extended them toward Karen and Jason. Her voice, clear and firm, left no room for doubt. "You can verify my identity in your system. I'm certain it will speak for itself." Karen glanced at the card, lips curled in contempt. She didn't even reach for it. "I've seen better fakes," she scoffed. "We're not that easy to trick." Jason jumped in like a parrot, nodding enthusiastically. "Exactly. Every time someone like her waves around some plastic, they think they've earned a seat up here. First class isn't for show-offs." But their insults weren't just insults. They were windows into a deeper rot. This wasn't about Michelle anymore. It was about an institution that had decided who was worthy based on appearance, on color, on deeply warped assumptions. And Michelle? She felt no rage, only clarity. This wasn't a one-time offense. This was a culture, a system, a silent machinery that had pushed too many good people down for far too long. She took a slow breath, grounding herself in resolve. "I'm asking one last time," she said, each word deliberate. "Verify my information." Karen tilted her head, arms crossed, voice projecting like a school principal drunk on power. "You can either walk back to economy," she barked, "or I'll call airport security and have you removed." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the hush before a storm breaks. Michelle stood tall, her presence now commanding the entire cabin, but inside her heart beat not with fear, but purpose. She knew exactly what needed to be done. and within moments she would make the call. Not just to defend her dignity, but to crack open the carefully polished shell Skywing Airlines had used to hide its ugliest truths. No more cover-ups. No more silence. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every passenger who'd ever been looked down upon, dismissed or erased. And Michelle Reed was done being quiet. The air inside the first-class cabin turned glacial, thick with unspoken judgment. Karen's threat still hung in the atmosphere like a fog, her voice having carved a cruel line through the silence. Michelle stood her ground, calm but unyielding. Her eyes, unwavering, searched Karen's face for a trace of reason, for even the smallest flicker of humanity. But all she saw was smug certainty. This wasn't about policy anymore, this was power on display, and in that moment it became clear. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was war. Then came the heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing from the cockpit. All heads turned as a commanding presence filled the aisle. Captain Brad Collins emerged, his crisp uniform immaculate, his face carved in stone. A senior pilot, with decades in the skies, Brad was respected, feared, and rigid. His eyes landed on Michelle with calculated coldness, his judgment already cast. Without requesting her identification, without asking a single question, he spoke, his voice sharp and final. "This passenger needs to be removed from the plane, immediately." It was not a request, it was a decree. And just like that, he turned the knife of injustice even deeper. Karen's lips curled into a victorious grin. She looked at Michelle not as a passenger, but as prey. Jason Miller snickered at her side, arms crossed like a child gloating over a cruel prank gone right. And then, authority arrived. Linda Foster, a senior airport security officer, appeared at the cabin entrance. Dressed in a Navy uniform and flanked by the unmistakable presence of an electric taser on her hip, she was the embodiment of no-nonsense authority. Her gaze swept across the room before falling on Michelle with icy focus. "You have exactly 1 minute to leave," Linda said, her tone cool and clipped. The entire cabin froze. Even the hum of the engines seemed still. Michelle didn't flinch. She met Linda's stare with calm defiance, not because she wanted a fight, but because something inside her refused to bend. She understood Linda wasn't the enemy, just another gear in a broken machine. But that didn't make this easier to swallow. "Before I go," Michelle said, her voice firm yet composed, "I'm requesting one last opportunity to have my identity verified." Captain Brad barely glanced at her. With the wave of a hand, he dismissed her as one would a persistent child. "We don't have time for games," he said. "Comply or be removed." Karen's grin widened. Jason's eyes twinkled with spite. But Michelle wasn't shaken. Instead, something stronger stirred within her. A crystal-clear sense of purpose. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't about a seat in first class. It was about the rot hiding in plain sight. The casual cruelty disguised as procedure. And she would root it out. All of it. Her chest rose as she took a deep breath and surveyed the faces before her. Karen's mask of pride, Jason's juvenile glee, Brad's unbending indifference, and Linda's stern neutrality. In mere moments, all of them would learn the weight of their actions. Because Michelle Reed wasn't just a passenger. She was a force. And what they had dismissed as weakness was about to become a reckoning. The tension held firm like a bowstring ready to snap. And then, softly, nervously, a voice pierced the silence. I found her ticket," it stammered. "It's valid. Please, check again." Every head turned. The voice belonged to a young flight attendant standing quietly near the galley, clutching a tablet in trembling hands. Truth had just taken its first breath. All eyes turned to the trembling voice. It belonged to Emily Turner, a young flight attendant with barely 6 months under her belt at Skywing Airlines. She stood pressed against a seat back, hands clenched tight, her cheeks flushed with fear. Her voice had cracked the tension like a sliver of sunlight piercing through storm clouds. She hadn't meant to speak. In fact, she had promised herself she wouldn't. But the truth had forced her hand. She had seen the scan. She knew the ticket was valid. Karen spun around, her icy glare landing on Emily like a sniper's scope. To Karen, this wasn't just a minor interruption. It was mutiny, and worse, it happened in front of passengers. "Emily," Karen snapped, her voice sharp as steel. "You're new. Step aside. Now." Her words sliced the air, laced with menace. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. Speak again, and your career is over. Jason chuckled beside her, clearly entertained. "Cute," he muttered, just loud enough for the nearby rogues to hear. "Little rookie doesn't know her place." Emily's head dipped instinctively, her body trembling under the weight of authority. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the cabin could hear it. But then she looked up. Michelle was watching her, calm, strong, unmoved. That silent gaze didn't ask for help, but it gave her courage. And in that moment, Emily found hers. She took a breath so deep it seemed to steady the whole cabin. Then, louder and clearer than before, she said, "I don't mean to cause trouble, but I personally watched Ms. Reed's ticket scan through the system. It was valid. We should double-check before making assumptions." Gasps whispered across the aisle. A few passengers nodded in agreement. The silence was cracking. Karen's expression twisted. She was losing control, and she knew it. She marched toward Emily, her voice low but venomous. "This is your final warning," she hissed. "Know your place or you'll be looking for another job tomorrow." Emily trembled, but didn't move. Her voice quivered. Yes. But her resolve didn't, because deep down she knew this wasn't just about one ticket. It was about integrity and standing on the right side of history. Across the aisle, Michelle's eyes softened. Gratitude filled her chest. Not just for the words, but for what they meant. In that moment, Michelle understood. She wasn't alone anymore. She had allies, not in title or rank, but in soul. People like Emily Turner, whose hearts were louder than their fear. And with that, something shifted in the air. What had once felt like a hopeless confrontation was now a spark. Then it spread. From behind the confrontation, another wave of awareness stirred. A woman in her mid-30s, with soft brown hair and intelligent eyes, sat quietly observing the scene. Sarah Johnson, an American travel blogger and longtime advocate for social justice, had been watching Michelle since the moment she boarded. Beside her sat Tom Carter, a sharp-suited young executive. His brows were furrowed, his jaw clenched. His silence was no longer passive, it was boiling. When Emily spoke up, both Sarah and Tom exchanged a look. It said everything. "This ends now." Sarah reached into her leather satchel and pulled out her phone with trembling hands, not from fear, but fury. In one swift motion, she launched the camera and hit record. No commentary, no filter, just truth. Through her lens, she captured it all. Michelle standing tall, unwavering. Karen's seething authority. Jason's sneering immaturity. Captain Brad's cold detachment, and, most powerfully, Emily's trembling courage. A quiet revolution had begun, and it was all on camera. What had started as one woman's silent investigation had just become a viral reckoning in the making. The images spoke louder than any voice ever could. From another angle, Tom raised his phone, capturing every breath, every flinch, every flicker of injustice that played out like a slow-motion train crash. His fingers clutched the device so tightly the knuckles turned white, a physical reflection of the rage swelling inside him. He and Sarah had never spoken before, two strangers from different walks of life, and yet, in this moment, they were bound by the same unshakable truth. Silence is complicity. As soon as they had enough footage, Sarah tapped open her social media app. Her caption was short, searing, and impossible to ignore. "Skywing scandal. Racism has no altitude." Within seconds, Tom followed suit. He posted his own angle of the incident using the same hashtag. Together, their videos lit the fuse. Dozens of views turned to hundreds. Hundreds erupted into thousands. Then tens of thousands. And soon the videos were everywhere, Reshared, retweeted, reposted. Comments poured in like a tidal wave of fury and disbelief. This is horrifying. How does a company as big as Skywing let this happen? This is not customer service, it's discrimination, live on camera. That woman has more grace in silence than the whole crew combined. Fire them. Now. The Skywing scandal hashtag rocketed to the top of trending lists across platforms. Verified accounts, influencers, and civil rights organizations began to weigh in. Advocacy groups retweeted the footage with calls for justice. Even a few high-profile celebrities shared their outrage. News outlets picked up the story in real time. What had started in a quiet cabin was now front-page news. And still, Karen and Jason remained oblivious. While the digital world ignited, they stood rooted in the illusion of control, basking in their unchecked authority. Karen's lips still curled in smug satisfaction, and Jason leaned back with arms folded, a grin plastered across his face. But the floor beneath them was already cracking. Michelle, ever composed, now turned her head slightly, locking eyes with Sarah and Tom. No words were exchanged, but a nod, subtle, steady, powerful. It wasn't gratitude for attention. It was gratitude for action. The silence in the cabin had shifted. What had once been uncomfortable submission had evolved into something heavier, shared indignation, a collective readiness to speak, to resist, to hold wrongdoers accountable. In mere minutes, those who weaponized power would face its return. Because even the smallest voice, when rooted in truth and courage, can unravel an entire structure of injustice. And in that cabin, the voices were no longer small. Karen began to feel it, that creeping heat of doubt behind her collar. The same passengers she had once dismissed now held up their phones. Eyes no longer avoided hers, they stared directly, watching, judging. She glanced towards Sarah and Tom, their cameras still rolling. She tried to ignore the lump rising in her throat, but it was there. A flicker of unease cracked her mask. But pride is a powerful drug. With one breath, Karen buried her rising fear and resurrected her defiance. She straightened her back, as if daring the world to challenge her authority. Meanwhile, Michelle remained where she had always been, still, poised, unreadable. No anger, no panic. Only power. The pressure swirled around her like a storm, trying to provoke a reaction, but she gave it none. In fact, with every passing second, her calm seemed to expand. And in the face of chaos, that composure became her sharpest weapon. She wasn't waiting for justice. She was drawing it toward her. With a quiet grace that cut through the storm, Michelle reached into her coat pocket, not with urgency, but with clarity. The phone in her hand looked no different than anyone else's, yet in that moment, it became her sharpest weapon. With a few swift taps she dialed. Her voice, measured, calm, almost unnervingly composed, rose just loud enough for Karen and Captain Brad to hear. "Jennifer," she said steadily, "notify the board immediately. They need to be aware of what's happening." The sentence landed like a gust of wind through the tense cabin. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Karen scoffed. She leaned in, eyes gleaming with mockery. "Who are you calling?" she sneered. "The police? Because, sweetie, we're the law here." Michelle didn't blink. Her silence was a mirror, one that forced Karen to confront something far more dangerous than a threat. Calm certainty. A few seconds later, the speaker crackled to life. On the other end, Jennifer Lee's voice came through, professional and unwavering. "Michelle, the board has received the viral footage. An emergency session is already underway. They're awaiting your direction." Karen's smirk faltered. Brad shifted uneasily, the iron in his expression beginning to rust. The air in the cabin changed. Passengers no longer looked curious. They looked alert. Something far more serious was unfolding before their eyes. Karen forced a chuckle, trying to shake off the weight pressing on her chest. "Oh, I'm impressed," she said bitterly. "Still pretending?" "A fake phone call doesn't get you into first class." Michelle didn't move. She didn't need to. And say, Because before another insult could leave Karen's lips, Michelle's phone buzzed again, this time with a voice every executive in the company would recognize instantly. "Michelle, this is Michael Harris speaking on behalf of the board," came the calm but commanding tone. "We're monitoring the situation. Your identity has been confirmed. You are CEO Michelle Reed, and you have full authority to act immediately. Proceed as you see fit." The words thundered through the cabin like a lightning strike. Karen's face turned ghost white. Brad Collins, once the impenetrable captain, grabbed the seat beside him to steady himself. Even Jason, who had spent the last 30 minutes smirking, stood frozen. All around, the passengers began to realize just who Michelle Reed was. Not a distressed traveler, not a mistaken identity, but the CEO of Skywing Airlines. The woman they had humiliated now held the fate of every person standing before her. Emily, still standing near the galley, trembled. Not in fear, but awe. Sarah and Tom didn't lower their phones for a second. Every expression, every shift of power, every collapsing ego. It was all captured. Karen swallowed hard. The woman she had called unworthy now stood taller than anyone else in the room. In desperation, Karen tried to laugh, but it landed like a dying breath. "Oh, the board? That's cute," she said, her voice trembling under a failing facade. "But let's not forget, you still don't belong in first class." Her words were defiant, but gone was the conviction. What remained was the sound of a woman clinging to power she no longer possessed. And Michelle? Still calm, still silent. But now she was no longer just a force of quiet resistance. She was the storm. Michelle didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. With practiced poise, she ended the call and lowered the phone to her lap. Her eyes, sighty, unwavering, swept across the cabin like a verdict already passed. The voice of Jennifer Lee returned, now unmistakably joined by a more commanding tone. Michael Harris, chairman of the board, cut through the line with clarity that didn't waver. "Michelle, this is Michael Harris. We confirm your identity as Michelle Reed, CEO of Skywing Airlines and one of our largest shareholders." He paused, then delivered the sentence that would change the entire landscape of that flight. "What has occurred here today is a flagrant violation of the values Skywing stands for. Discrimination of any kind, especially racism, will not be tolerated. The board stands behind you fully. Take whatever action you deem appropriate." The cabin filled with whispers and gasps. Passengers exchanged shocked glances. A few lifted their phones again, instinctively recording the moment. There was no longer a question of what they were witnessing. This was history. Corporate injustice undone, live at 30,000 feet. Karen's skin drained of color. Her jaw clenched, but no words came. The confidence she had weaponized for years dissolved into dust. Desperately she looked to Jason, then Brad, as if either could offer her an exit. But Jason wouldn't meet her eyes. His face was pale, slack, his earlier mockery now curdled into shame. Brad stood still, shoulders sagging under the crushing weight of self-betrayal. He, the veteran captain known for poise and principle, now felt the bitter truth. He'd failed the very standards he was sworn to uphold. In the stunned silence, Michelle rose slowly. Her words were quiet, but they filled every corner of the cabin. "I want everyone here to understand something very clearly," she said, her gaze sweeping over Karen, Jason, Brad, and beyond. "No title, no badge, no uniform gives you the right to let prejudice overpower decency. I am Michelle Reed," she continued, "and as CEO of Skywing Airlines I will not allow this behavior to define who we are or who we become." Every syllable landed with surgical precision. Hope, for those still clinging to authority, evaporated instantly. Karen's knees buckled. She gripped a nearby seat to stay upright, her fingers white against the leather. Her lips parted, but her voice had abandoned her. She had ruled this cabin like a monarch. Now she couldn't even speak. Brad stared at the floor, the burn of humiliation crawling up his spine. His proud legacy, decades in the making, unraveled in front of strangers with camera phones. Jason, who had lit the match with smug laughter, now shrank into silence. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. He couldn't bring himself to lift his head. Not after everything. Then Michelle spoke again, calmer but colder than ever. I gave each of you a chance to pause, to verify, to think. But you didn't fail because you lacked facts. Her eyes locked onto Karen's. You failed because you lacked humanity. The words cut like a blade. And no one, not Brad, not Jason, not Karen, could stop the bleeding. Michelle's voice rang out, calm as ice and just as unyielding. Anyone involved in this act of discrimination and abuse of power, she declared, is hereby terminated, effective immediately. Her words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They were final. You have 5 minutes to gather your belongings and leave this aircraft. Your official termination notices will follow today. Karen's eyes widened in disbelief, her face contorting between shock and desperation. She took a halting step forward, lips trembling, searching for one last thread of mercy. But there was none. Michelle didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, final, immovable. Brad, once the embodiment of command, lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His hands hung at his sides, limp with shame. The man who had once soared with pride now looked grounded by the weight of his own failure. Jason clenched his fists tightly, so tightly the color drained from his knuckles. Just moments ago he was mocking, untouchable. Now the reality of what he'd lost settled in like concrete. A once promising career, gone in seconds. Around them, passengers filmed in silence, not for drama, but for history. This was no longer a scandal, it was a reckoning. And it had a name. Skywing Justice. A hashtag that had already eclipsed the earlier trend, fueled by millions now witnessing corporate power finally held accountable. In every corner of the internet, praise for Michelle Reed flooded the feed. This woman didn't just talk about change, she enforced it. Michelle Reed just redefined leadership at 30,000 feet. Skywing better realize it's her airline now. As the energy in the cabin shifted, young flight attendant Emily Turner looked on. No longer shaking, but shining. Her admiration for Michelle wasn't just professional, it was personal. Michelle's stance had protected not only her dignity, but Emily's belief in what was right. Across the aisle, even Linda Foster, the stern security officer who had once prepared to escort Michelle out, stood frozen. She didn't speak, but her expression was unmistakable. Silent remorse. A silent thanks. Michelle glanced at her watch. 5 minutes. Then, with calm finality, she spoke again. Your time is up. I suggest you leave. The command, quiet as it was, thundered like a gavel through the cabin. It marked not just the end of an incident, but the collapse of a regime built on arrogance. Karen, Brad, and Jason had no choice. Under the watchful, judging eyes of the very passengers they had disrespected, they gathered their things. No words, no excuses, just the long, humiliating walk down the aisle. The silence that followed was no longer fearful, it was solemn. Justice had been served, but Michelle knew this was only the beginning. As the three disappeared behind the cabin door, a wave of collective relief swept through the first-class cabin. The air felt lighter. The energy had shifted. But Michelle remained still. Her eyes tracked them until the last one exited. Only then did she speak, more to herself than anyone else. This isn't the end. It's the beginning. The fight ahead would be harder, longer, but it would be worth it. She would rebuild Skywing. Every policy, every employee, every culture, from the inside out. Then a small presence stepped forward. Emily, still trembling, but this time with purpose, not fear. Her voice was soft, but every word carried weight. Miss Reed, I have something you need to see, she said, holding out her phone. I recorded it. Karen and Jason, I overheard them earlier conspiring to remove your seat from the system. The entire cabin froze. Emily looked around, then added, more firmly, it was deliberate. They wanted to make it look like your first-class seat didn't exist. A hush fell over the room. Michelle looked at the young woman, no longer just an employee, but a whistleblower, a spark. She gave Emily a nod, strong, affirming. "Play the recording, Emily," she said. Emily's hands trembled as she tapped play, her voice still shaking from the weight of what she was about to reveal. For a moment the cabin was breathless. Then, out of her small phone speaker, truth spilled like wildfire. "Just remove her name from the seating list, Jason," Karen's voice said coldly. "Someone like her doesn't deserve to be here." Jason's voice followed. "Quick system change, no one will even notice. I mean, who'd believe a casually dressed black woman belongs in first class, easy as cake?" Then his laugh, smug, mocking, poisonous. The recording ended, and the cabin exploded into gasps. Shock rippled through the air like a physical wave. Passengers turned to one another in disbelief. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads, a few stood still, tears of anger welling in their eyes. There was no more room for doubt, no misunderstanding to hide behind. The truth had landed, clean and undeniable. Emily lowered her phone. Her eyes glistened with tears, whether from fear or relief, even she couldn't tell. She knew this moment would change her forever. Michelle stepped forward and placed a steady hand on Emily's shoulder. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice clear enough for every passenger to hear. "Skywing needs people like you." That one sentence melted the tension inside Emily's chest. The passengers around her nodded in agreement, and soft, reverent applause broke out. Small at first, then stronger. A round of appreciation not just for the whistleblower, but for the courage it took to stand up in the darkest hour. Linda Foster, the security officer who had nearly played a part in this injustice, stood still. Her eyes cast down, her expression conflicted. She realized just how close she had come to crossing a line she could never return from. Then Michelle turned to the cabin as a whole. "We've all just witnessed something painful, but necessary," she said, each word cutting through the silence like light through storm clouds. "This behavior, this racism, will never again have a place on Skywing Airlines, I give you my word. From today forward, we lead with justice, with integrity, with humanity." The room held still, not out of fear, but reverence. They knew, every soul on board, that they had witnessed a moment that would echo far beyond the walls of that plane. Beside Michelle, Emily stood taller, not just a junior flight attendant now, but a symbol. Proof that even the quietest voice can ignite change. Michelle had regained control of her airline. But more than that, she had reclaimed its soul. And then, with her voice cool as ever, she turned to Linda and issued the final command. "Linda," Michelle said, locking eyes with her, "escort these individuals off the plane. This is no longer a request, it's an order." Linda nodded firmly this time. Her silence was gone, replaced by resolve. She understood the gravity of what had just unfolded, and what needed to happen next. She stepped forward, facing Karen, Brad, and Jason. "Please gather your belongings," she said. "You are to exit the aircraft immediately." Karen didn't resist. Her body sagged under the weight of consequences. Her legs shook as she reached for her bag. Her face, once filled with pride and control, was now hollow. She clung to a nearby seat just to stay upright. Each step she took was slow, painful, echoing the downfall of someone who had once ruled through fear. Brad Collins, the once proud captain, followed, his back hunched, his shoulders sunken. It looked as if he'd aged 20 years in the span of 5 minutes. He had lost more than just a job. He'd lost his sense of self. Jason brought up the rear, the swagger gone, his head hung low, not a word spoken, just the footsteps of regret. Linda walked with them down the aisle. No one made a sound. Dozens of passengers held up their phones, not to mock, but to document. The lens was now the courtroom. And this? Their sentencing. None of them dared to look back. When the trio disappeared behind the cabin door, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. A moment of reckoning, a rare kind of justice that doesn't often happen in the real world. And it happened here, at 30,000 feet. Michelle Reed remained standing, her posture regal, her gaze focused. She knew this was not the end. It was the beginning of a larger war, a fight to cleanse every corner of the airline she helped build, a vow to root out every trace of bias, every shadow of cruelty, until the sky was safe. For everyone. As she turned to look at the passengers, who now looked back with nothing but awe and respect, she said the quietest words of the day, but perhaps the most powerful. Let this be the last time. And with that, justice had spoken, and the sky, at long last, began to clear. As the door closed behind Karen, Brad, and Jason, a quiet stillness settled over the cabin. The tension that had held the air captive finally began to dissolve. Linda Foster remained standing at the threshold, her expression no longer stern but marked by genuine regret. She turned to Michelle with humility in her voice. "Ms. Reed," she said quietly, "I sincerely apologize. I came dangerously close to making a mistake I might never have forgiven myself for. I now understand the weight of my responsibility, and I accept whatever consequences may follow." Michelle studied her for a moment. Her gaze, once cutting, softened slightly. "Because even those who stumble deserve the chance to rise, if they're willing to rise differently." "You've just learned the most important lesson of your career," Michelle said with a calm resolve. "At Skywing, we don't tolerate injustice, but we do believe in second chances for those who choose to do the right thing." Linda nodded, her shoulders easing for the first time. She had made a silent vow to never again turn a blind eye, and Michelle had given her the chance to live that vow. Then Michelle faced the cabin. Her voice carried not just authority but a warmth that cut through the chill of what had just occurred. "I want to extend a sincere apology to all of you," she said, looking each passenger in the eye. "What you witnessed should never have happened. Skywing Airlines is committed to eradicating all forms of discrimination, fully, transparently, and permanently." She paused, letting her next words land like anchors in every heart. "Everyone deserves respect, regardless of race, appearance, status, or seat number." Applause broke out, soft at first, then growing in strength. It wasn't polite. It was heartfelt. The storm had passed, and in its wake something brighter was beginning to rise. Michelle turned to Emily Turner, who stood frozen in awe, still absorbing the gravity of what she had just helped change. Michelle placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "It's because of people like you, Emily, that justice prevails." Then, with a subtle but powerful smile, she continued, "I'm proud to announce your immediate promotion. From this day forward, you'll take on a new role at Skywing, one that represents the courage and integrity we're committed to building." Emily's eyes welled with tears. She blinked in disbelief, then nodded, her voice stolen by emotion but her heart full of purpose. The passengers rose again in applause, this time louder, fuller, celebrating not just a decision, but a future being rewritten in real time. Emily had entered this flight as an intern. She would leave it as a symbol. Linda Foster stepped forward too, no longer in the shadows of command, but in the light of accountability. Her nod to Michelle said everything, a promise to protect the values that had nearly slipped through her grasp. Michelle turned one last time to the passengers. "I know today's flight didn't unfold as expected," she said with a warm, sincere smile. "But I hope you leave with something far more important than a destination. We all deserve dignity, equality, and the courage to stand for both." The entire cabin stood in unison. Applause shook the aisles, this time a declaration, a shared belief that change had taken flight. Michelle sat down, finally, as the aircraft prepared for its real journey. The cabin resumed its quiet order, but, beneath it all, a hum of something powerful remained. They all knew they had witnessed more than a disruption. They had witnessed a turning point. Michelle looked out the window, her reflection meeting her gaze. She knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would not be easy. But she was ready, because now Skywing Airlines would fly on new wings, not only built on business excellence, but on compassion, fairness, and truth. She would never be alone again. Emily stood with her, and behind them, an entire generation ready to carry justice into the skies. This is the story of Michelle Reed, a woman who dared to confront injustice in her own cabin, who reminded the world that real power isn't about rank or wealth. It's about courage, accountability, and the relentless choice to do what's right. If you were Michelle Reed in this situation, what would you do? Let us know in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories about justice, respect, and human dignity. Together we rise. As Michelle Reed returned to her seat, the applause slowly faded, replaced by a reverent silence that carried more weight than any words. The flight was no longer just a journey between two cities. It had become a living testament to courage, justice, and the quiet revolution that can rise from a single act of resistance. Outside the window, clouds drifted peacefully across a vast sky, but inside, every heart on board felt changed. No one would remember this flight by its flight number or duration. They would remember the woman who stood up not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, sidelined, or seen as invisible. But stories like this don't end when the applause dies down. In truth, that's where they begin. In the days that followed, Skywing Airlines faced both public scrutiny and overwhelming support. Michelle didn't hide. She stepped forward, not with PR spin or hollow apologies, but with transparency, reforms, and most importantly, with heart. Mandatory diversity training was just the beginning. New leadership standards were implemented, and the voices of frontline workers like Emily were brought into decision-making rooms for the first time in the airline's history. And yet, beyond all the headlines and boardroom decisions, what lingered in people's minds was something deeper, something quietly profound. That power, real power, is not about hierarchy or uniforms. It's about choices. It's about the choice to speak up when staying silent is easier. It's about the choice to lead with integrity, even when no one's watching. It's about the choice to treat people, every person, not by the clothes they wear, their skin color, or their seat assignment, but by the simple, unshakable truth that they are human and worthy of dignity. Michelle's story reminded the world that justice is not reserved for courtrooms or government halls. Sometimes it happens in aisle 4C at 30,000 feet. Sometimes it begins with a trembling voice and a phone recording. Sometimes it comes from the courage of a woman who chooses to carry her pain with grace and her power with humility. And perhaps the most beautiful truth of all? That change isn't reserved for CEOs or headlines. It's inside each of us. In every moment we choose to treat someone with kindness. In every second we refuse to let prejudice go unchallenged. In every heartbeat that whispers, "You have a voice, use it." Michelle Reed's name will be remembered. But so will Emily Turner's. So will every passenger who chose to bear witness, every person who pressed record, every stranger who stood with another stranger when it mattered most. This wasn't just a victory for one woman. It was a reminder for all of us that the world can change if we're willing to change it. And when that plane finally landed, it didn't just touch the ground. It touched something higher,